Thank you very much, Mr. Howarth. Pleasure to have you looking after us this afternoon under your sure guidance, and also congratulations to the Honourable Gentleman from Midlothian for bringing forward this extremely important issue. It's very tempting, Mr. Howarth, at moments like this when the entire world is running around with its hair on fire, worrying about all sorts of other, admittedly incredibly urgent, incredibly big problems, to forget that there are some important, critical pieces of democratic plumbing which need to be attended to no matter what else is going on. And so I congratulate him for not losing sight of that essential, fundamental truth, if we can. I will try and make sure that I leave him with a couple of minutes at the end just to sort of respond or sum up if he wishes. But there have been a number of important points made, Mr. Howarth, and I've always sworn to myself, promised myself, Mr. Howarth, that if I ever get to the point here where I start quoting my own speeches, I will know that it's time to leave. So I promise not to do that, but I would suggest to honourable gentlemen and ladies here that they might want to have a look at a speech which I made at Policy Exchange about a year ago, where I basically said very much along the lines of what some of the criticisms which have been levelled at the voter registration system so far. What we have is a system which is, to put it charitably, in transition. There has been some good work done. The system of online registration is new and is, by I think any accounts, an awful lot better than what went before, even though it was so popular that it then fell over rather embarrassingly just before the registration deadline. So there have been changes, but what we are still battling with is a vast majority of our registration process which is designed for an analogue age. It is based on an old-fashioned approach, paper-based, process-driven rather than outcomes-focused, and anything which is remotely digital. And clearly there is a huge amount that needs to be done, as we've heard right across the political spectrum during the course of the contributions this afternoon, in order to update it. And I'm delighted that the honourable gentleman from Edinburgh East, who speaks for the SNP, pointed out that there is clearly a substantial cross-party backing for progress here. And I think he's absolutely right. And I think that a number of people have said that for this to work well, it is best of all if it can be done on a cross-party, non-partisan approach, because voter registration is something which we all, as Democrats, ought to be in favour of. It is something which we all, as Democrats, ought to be trying to push forward, and it actually works better in terms of combating some of the voter disillusionment, which we've also all mentioned during the course of today, if people can see that it isn't just one party or the other pushing this, because they will then assume that that one party has got a particular axe to grind or not. It's far more powerful if everybody says the same thing, if everybody sings from the same hymn sheet on this. And so I'm particularly pleased that we all are, I think, on the same page on this. What I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about what we are already doing, because I am delighted to tell the honourable gentleman from Midlothian that we are, I think, headed in a very similar direction. There are some definitional questions and there's some important points of detail which we need to bottom out, but we are headed in very similar destinations and directions. So last month, Mr. Howarth, I introduced a statutory instrument in this place which began the very, very early steps in that process. It had a couple of very, very modest proposals, but they are actually quite significant in terms of beginning to digitise our process. One of them, for example, was simply to make it possible to use emails when you are confirming whether or not someone is being registered or not, rather than having to send a snail mail, old-fashioned paper letter. Now, that may sound like a really, really basic change, but it required a legal change in this place. We had to pilot an SI to take it through, and there are a number of other measures which were in the same SI as well. And it can make a very, very significant alteration to both the speed and the efficiency and the cost-effectiveness of registration. But it gives, I hope, everybody here an idea about where we are starting from and how much further we have to travel. But I can also confirm to him that I think it's on Monday, Mr. Howarth, there is a further SI due to come to this place, which will take us a couple more steps down the road. I'm not going to overclaim on this, but it is moving in the direction which I think everybody has said they want to move. So on Monday we are talking about changes which will be piloted to begin with in 3 local authorities, Ryedale, Birmingham and South Lakeland. And these are ideas which, following up on the suggestions about the importance of localism and devolution being important sources of ideas here, these are ideas which in many cases have been proposed by local authority electoral registration officers, because they are the people who are at the front line. They are the people who understand which bits of the process still work and which bits of the process are frankly a waste of time and are having them chewing their arms off in frustration because it's just so slow and inefficient, and they are the ones who are coming up with many of the most creative and practical proposals. So we are taking their ideas, we are encouraging them to submit ideas, and we are therefore trying to take those forward. And what they're saying for this SI on Monday, we will obviously go through it in more detail, Mr. Houth at the time, but they're talking about just changing from a household inquiry form arriving on your doorstep to check whether or not who should be registered to vote, to something called a household notification letter, which basically says we think the following people are in this place and they should be registered, please tell us if not. And it changes the way it's done. It's far more efficient. It doesn't require the same degree of response, and more of it can be done electronically. And in 2 of the 3 local authorities, we're also going to match that in with some data matching using local data sources so that we can focus the effort, so that we aren't then having to require them to go and knock on everybody's doors even when they know who already is living behind that door, which is clearly a massive waste of effort, a waste of resources, and those resources could in many cases be better targeted on the places where we don't know, where if you know that somebody has been living there for the last 20 years and there's no point in going and knocking on the door to confirm it, why don't you take the time and the effort that you're going to take to spend on that and instead go and spend it in the block of flats down the other end of the road where you have huge gaps in your register and you know actually you've got much more of a problem. So that is a step in the right direction. But it's only a step. We are still only in the foothills of the transition, which we've all been talking about and which I would completely endorse. Because we need to be careful here, Mr. Houth, because the idea of automatic registration is used, understandably, I think, quite widely, quite loosely. We all probably mean slightly different things when we talk about automatic registration, and some of those things are crashingly obvious and desirable, and we should get on and do them tomorrow. And other of those things, in some cases, are potentially quite dangerous. So I think that what most people mean, and most people I think would agree, is a really obviously sensible thing to do, is to start by using more local data, as we are doing in a couple of these pilots I just mentioned, and to start using that data to inform what we're doing on registration. Not only because it then tells you an awful lot more about who is behind the door because they're either paying council tax or they have a car parking permit or they've got a library card, you name it. There's all sorts of different forms of local data. But also because it then allows you to focus your efforts elsewhere where you don't have that data or where you have significant question marks over its quality or its veracity, and you know that you have further work to do to fill in the gaps. The Honourable Gentleman from Edinburgh East was trying to anticipate some of my likely, or what he thought were my likely objections to automatic registration, or at least to data-driven registration, if I can try to get a bit more specific about what we might collectively mean by this. And I'm happy to tell him that I'm not going to raise any of the ones that he suggested. I mean, he ran through there's a checklist of sort of standard Whitehall excuses about why we can't do things, which usually start off with, it's too expensive. And then if that's not true, then they say, well, we're doing it already. And the third one is that the IT won't handle it. That's a common one. And it's the equivalent of, for Star Trek fans, Mr. Houth, it's the equivalent of Scotty saying, I can't give you any more, Captain. The engines are going flat out already. And actually, those won't work. He's absolutely right. We can do more here, and we jolly well should. So using local data is essential. But it is difficult to work out which bits of local data are reliable. So the principle, I think, is widely accepted. But actually finding out which specific fields in which database, for what purpose, actually give you a robust data set to say, we know that this person is here and that they are eligible to vote. And again, we've had it from, I think, the lady from Sheffield, but certainly the gentleman from Edinburgh, that we need to be careful as well that we don't end up with registering people who are certainly living there but may not be legally eligible to vote, either because they are foreign nationals and aren't eligible to vote in the UK or for some other reason. We will end up switching from a problem of missing millions, false negatives in the jargon, through to a problem of false positives, i.e. enrolling people who shouldn't be there at all. And so we need to make sure that we are, by using this local data, being confident enough that it's telling us things which are reliable, and therefore there's an awful lot of detailed, crashingly detailed, but absolutely essential work to do to make it happen. When you've got to the point where I think we all agree that data-driven registration is sensible, then you come on to the question about what degree of data-driven automaticity we're willing to accept. At the moment, we have an opt-in system where you have to come along and say, I want to exercise my right to vote. I want to exercise my right to register to vote. Now, actually, there's a fundamental principle here which all parties, I think, sign up to about individual electoral registration, which is it is kind of essential in a democracy that people do say, I want to use my right to vote. But having said it once, we don't necessarily have to ask them year in, year out for the rest of their lives. I mean, if they change their mind, they're democratically entitled to do that. But having said, I want to exercise my right to register to vote, then it should be just a question of tracking when they move house and making sure we've got the address changes correct. Now, that is easy to say and extremely difficult to do, but there shouldn't be a permission issue thereafter, I believe. So we need to address that piece as well. But the difference between an opt-in system, where we say, we know you're living there, but do you want to register, to potentially an opt-out system, which is one possibility, or indeed a we're not even going to ask you system, which I think is a bit more dangerous and a bit more questionable as to whether or not that's really acceptable in a free society and and tricky for civil liberties views in some respects. Those are the sorts of questions which I would be delighted if we were sophisticated enough and we had updated our system enough to start worrying about. At the moment, we can get huge amounts of progress just by doing the data, and we will get the 80-20 rule applies. We get 80% of the benefit from getting the data stuff done as fast as we can, which won't be easy because it's so detailed. And when we've got to the point where we are then saying, well, now how much of an opt-in or an opt-out system do we want to have, I will be delighted at that point, because we will have made huge progress from where we are before. And because, as has been pointed out rightly, Mr. Howarth, there are so many groups within our society where the picture of registration is uneven. And in many cases, I would argue from a point of view of social justice, unjustly uneven as well. Interestingly, the group which is both biggest and least well registered hasn't been mentioned by anybody at all here this evening, which is expatriates. We have several million expat voters currently legally eligible to vote. Their registration rate is something like 5%, and there are several million, therefore, unregistered expatriates who are legally enfranchised as we stand here today. That is the biggest single democratic outrage, as the gentleman from Edinburgh said, that we have. But there are many others. Some BME groups, not all, some BME groups, incidentally, Mr. Howarth, are very well registered. They have very high registration rates, but others don't. Some disabled groups have very, very low registration rates, others better so. Many people who live in short-term letting accommodation have problems too, and that includes students as well. So there's a huge amount which we can do, Mr. Howarth, and I hope that therefore I have both reassured the honourable gentleman and also perhaps tempted him a little as I show a little bit of ankle about where we're trying to get to and where we would like to take this. But I think that we have a degree of cross-party unanimity on the direction of travel and the amount of work that we can do. So I hope that is reassuring. I won't, Mr. Howarth, go into the parallel separate problem of individual electoral registration, where I disagree with almost everything that's been said, but that's a different conversation and a much longer debate. But I think that on this, we can make common cause, we should make common cause, and with any luck, with a degree of cross-party unanimity, we will be able to make progress.
Wind up. Thank you, Mr. Howarth, and I'd like to thank all honourable members for the contributions to this, I think, very important issue. It's particularly encouraging, I think, to hear the level of agreement in at least general terms about the direction we need to be travelling in to make sure that the participation levels we see in elections, whatever nature they happen to be across this country, are as high as they possibly can be, and that we do whatever we possibly can to remove the barriers that do exist for so many people. I'm encouraged by the comments from the Minister that there are some steps being taken. I'd personally like to see it a lot faster, but at least if we start talking about pace, that's an entirely different argument to whether it should happen in the first place or not. So I do accept that point, and I very much look forward to seeing what other actions and what other proposals can come forward, because I think many of us do want to get to that point of being able to have the debate and the discussion about what type of automatic registration system we have, rather than whether we should actually have one in the first place or not. So I do very much welcome that. Hopefully we can see this taking yet further steps forward in the weeks and months ahead, and get to a point where we can actually make these decisions that will benefit so many hundreds of thousands, millions of people across the country. So thank you.
The question is that this House has considered automatic registration in UK elections. Have any of that opinion say aye? Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.